Hey, it's Beanie, and welcome to another book video. So if you watched my fall TBR video, then you would know that I was planning to read a lot of popular books this season, so books that were super hyped on Book Talk or BookTube. And I actually did stick to that TBR pretty well over the past couple of months, so I read 10 books over September and October, and I wanted to sit here and give you my reviews and thoughts on all of those books, so that if there's any that you've been hearing a lot about that you haven't got to yet, I can hopefully help you make a decision on what to pick up and read next. So the first book I read in September was The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. So I read this book on my Kobo, and I actually was originally not planning on reading it because I feel like whenever there's a super popular series that gets put out and then years later more books get added to it, it just kind of feels like a money grab, and I feel like a lot of the time the new book is just not as good as the series, and in a worst case scenario it ends up ruining the series. But there's actually a movie coming out for this book on November 17th, so I did kind of want to give it a go just because I think it's really fun to read a book that has a movie attached to it so you can read it and then go to the theater and feel special because you're one of the people who read the book first. So this book follows a teenage age Coriolanus Snow, who later we know becomes President Snow in the Hunger Games trilogy, and we know from the Hunger Games trilogy that he is kind of the villain and a not so nice guy, so I was assuming that this book would be kind of like his villain origin story or something like that. So Coriolanus is the kind of guy who thinks he's a good person, but he sometimes makes questionable decisions and kind of justifies it by saying he's doing bad things but for the right reason or for the greater good. So my main cons with this book is, firstly, Coriolanus Snow is just not a likable character at all, and I just did not like reading from his perspective. He spends a ton of time, particularly in the beginning, just complaining about everything, which is kind of justifiable. He's in a tough spot. If you ever read this, you'll see what his situation is, but he's going through a tough time, but just the way that he complains is just not interesting to me. Like, Katniss Everdeen was having issues, but you could see how she was fighting through them and trying to combat the system, go against the odds, and that's what made her really interesting and likable, whereas Coriolanus just complains and, does nothing, and that was really annoying to me. In addition to Coriolanus' character being a little bit insufferable, I also didn't really like a lot of the secondary characters. I felt like a lot of them were kind of one-dimensional and just not too interesting. One cool part about this book is we get to see a little bit of the origins of the Hunger Games themselves and how certain mechanisms come to be and how people think about how to add little things to the Hunger Games to spice them up. But as the audience, since we're from the point of view of Coriolanus, who isn't in the Hunger Games himself, we're only seeing the Hunger Games through the TV screen as it gets broadcasted to the world, so we definitely don't get as much of an in-depth view of the games themselves as we do in the Hunger Games series, where we're seeing from the POV of Katniss. But I did actually really like all of the Hunger Games parts of this book. I thought they were done really well. So yeah, that's why I gave this book 3 stars. I would still recommend it if you love the Hunger Games or you want to read this before the movie comes out. Then I think it's still entertaining. I know a lot of people really loved this book, but it is just one of those things where if you just love the original series so much, then this might be disappointing. So the next book I finished in September was Red Rising by Pierce Brown. And I know we still have 2 more months before the end of the year, but I will not be surprised if this is my favorite book of the year because I loved it so much. So Red Rising is the first book in a trilogy, and the genre is sci-fi, which I wasn't sure if I was going to enjoy. I don't think I've read any sci-fi books before. And I was a little bit nervous before reading this book, thinking that it might be kind of difficult or hard to understand. I was seeing some people online saying that they were really confused reading this book, or that it was just taking them a long time to get through because there was a lot of confusing stuff happening. But this book literally blew all of my expectations out of the water. There's a lot of themes of war and politics, but there's also tons of themes of friendship and loyalty and love and loss and all of that emotional stuff that I was just not really expecting out of this book. I just felt like I could really relate to these characters because of their moral dilemmas that they would face and just, doing the right thing but feeling guilty about it for other reasons, or questioning someone's destiny or their purpose. And I just felt like the relationships between the characters specifically were really the heart of this story, where the action and everything was used to kind of drive the plot along, but he would really slow down in his writing and take little moments to have these really deep connections between characters, or parts where you really get a deep view into what the character's thinking and feeling. And that was just really special. I just think something about his writing was amazing, and I did not think that I was going to get emotional from a sci-fi war-themed book, but I definitely did. So yeah, this book already just has such a special place in my heart, but in terms of being sci-fi and difficult to read, I would say the main parts that might make it tricky is maybe the character names. There is quite a lot of characters, and they have not normal names, so I find sometimes it's a little bit harder to remember names when they're not everyday names that we're used to. So if you deal with situations where you read a character's name and you just completely forgot who you are, there's no shame in Googling. I did that a few times where I just looked up Red Rising, character's name, and then a little description would come up. So feel free to do that if that's the issue you're running into. The second thing would be, since this is sci-fi, there is some technology, and Pierce Brown doesn't necessarily give a big description of everything. He'll kind of just say the name of the technology, and you kind of have to use context clues to piece together what that thing is. So being someone who does not consume sci-fi, I would not really understand how to visualize some of like the weapons or whatever spacey stuff that was going on. I would just recommend going slower with this one. It doesn't look like it's that big of a book, but the font size is fairly small. So I don't know, maybe just focus more on taking your time and going slower. So yeah, I don't think you should be too worried about this book being hard, and even if it is, it's well worth the effort. I also just finished Golden Sun, which is the second book in the Red Rising trilogy, and I did finish this in November, not October, but I just thought while I'm here I'll give it a little review. So in short, 5 stars, fast-paced, made me cry, made me laugh, made me audibly gasp because there were some twists that I was not expecting. But I just love this series so much, and it's such a special feeling when you know that you're in the middle of a series that you think is going to be your favorite series. So I obviously haven't read the 3rd book yet, that's going to be Morningstar, and I do plan to read that before the end of the year, but I would not be surprised if Red Rising becomes my favorite series I've ever read, so I'm very excited to finish it off. So the next book I read after Red Rising was Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmis. So the first thing I want to talk about actually is the cover of this book, because I actually read online that the author herself did not like the cover because she felt like it didn't portray the story very well. And I have to agree, because I think that this cover, matched with the title, makes this look like a silly kind of romance or rom-com book, which this is not that at all. Over the summer, I was on a little bit of a romance kick, so I was at the bookstore picking up some Ali Hazelwood books, and this was on the same table with those other books. So I decided to grab it and give it a go and see what it was like. And again, not really a romance book, but I could not have been more pleased with the type of book that this ended up being. So this book follows the story of Elizabeth Zott, who is a chemist in the 1960s, but she's struggling to be taken seriously by her male colleagues because of sexism. But Elizabeth's character is written so wonderfully, where she's able to take everything on the chin and she just doesn't listen to what anyone says, and she decides that she wants to be a chemist and she's going to do it no matter what, even if she has to go to great lengths to be able to continue on with the research that she wants to do. But through a very interesting turn of events, Elizabeth ends up being the main host of a cooking show called Supper at 6, but I'll let you read the book to see how that happens. So this book does cover a couple of very deep topics, the first being SA, which I want to put a trigger warning. At the very beginning of this book, we get a fairly graphic scene that shows that, so if you are sensitive to that or don't want to read about that kind of thing, then definitely look up where that is and skip that part. And this book also discusses grief, so I guess another trigger warning. But I personally felt that this was not a very heavy book to read. I thought that even though it went over deep topics like that could have been very dark and sad, I thought this book honestly read like a sitcom. Like, it was just written in such a lighthearted way, and I felt like I could visualize everything so perfectly as it happened, so it was so exciting to come home every day and read this book because it honestly felt like a movie playing in my head. And all of the characters were so vibrant and likable and funny, and I laughed out loud so many times while reading this. And I just think it's so rare that a book can address heavy subjects that are so important, like sexism and like the other things that I mentioned, but not make it feel heavy, because I personally read for entertainment, and even if there's something that has a really important message in it, if it's going to make me sad and feel gross and heavy at the end of the day, I'm probably just not going to read it. But I'm just really happy that there's a popular book like this out there that gives some representation to women in STEM. I personally am a woman studying in a STEM field. I'm studying mechanical engineering at university right now, so there were definitely some things that Elizabeth went through that made me feel seen, and that was really nice. So even though this book is set in the 1960s, where the sexism and all of that was probably way worse, it definitely is still here today, and I would just encourage anyone to pick this book up, especially if you're a man, just so you can get a little perspective on what some women have to go through, especially in scientific fields. And there's even a dog character named 630 who is amazing and hilarious, so there's that too. But yeah, easy 5-star read, love this book. So then the next book I read was also on my Kobo, and it was A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. So this book I actually read in my fall reading vlog, if you have seen that, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about the plot because I talked about it quite a lot in that other video. So this is the first book of a fantasy series, and it follows a girl named Farah who ends up having to go live in the fairy kingdom, except the fairies, as far as the humans know, are very evil, so we don't know what's going to happen. Overall, I'd say this book starts off a little slower paced, but then it really picks up near the end. So just in case you try this and you feel like it's a little bit boring at the beginning, I would really encourage you to keep going because the ending of this book and then the next books after this are a lot quicker, and that's when I think the story really shines and takes off. So I had a really great time reading this book. I rated it 4 stars, and I also went ahead and read the second and third books in this series. Not all like one after the other, but I'm just going to review them all together because that makes it easier. So the next book in this series is A Court of Mist and Fury, also known as Akamoth, or everyone's favorite book in the series. So if you follow Book Talk or BookTube, then you know anyone talking about the ACOTAR series loves the second book the most, and after reading this, I might have to agree. So like I said, the first book, ACOTAR, starts off a little bit slower and then picks up the pace near the end, where this book continues that fast pace all the way through. So much happens in this book. We meet a bunch of new characters, and I just think it's really amazing. I had such an entertaining time reading this, and I would definitely recommend reading the first book, if not just to get to this one. So my rating for A Court of Mist and Fury would be a little bit higher than ACOTAR, so I would give that one 4.5 stars. And then the third book, A Court of Wings and Ruin, also known as ACOWAR. So this book I would rate 4.25 stars, which I know I'm getting really specific, but I definitely liked Akamoth a little bit more than this book, but I felt like they also kind of had similar vibes, so I wanted them to be similar ratings. Again, this book keeps up with that fast pace. We keep up with a lot of the really great characters we met from the second book, but we get to know them a little bit more deeply in this book. There are like war and strategy themes, which I don't know if everyone is into, but for me, I really liked it. I thought they did it in a really fun, interesting way. So I still have 2 books left to finish off the ACOTAR series, but some people were saying that the 4th and the 5th books were not their favorite, so I don't know how I'm going to feel. I'm a little bit nervous that I'm not going to like them, because I know that the 5th book is not from the POV of Farah. It's actually from the point of view of her sister Nesta, and some people do not like that character. But I liked these 3 books so much, and I really like Sarah J. Maas's writing, so I'm just going to keep my hopes high, and I'll go into those books hoping for the best, expecting them to be slightly less good than these first 3, but we'll see. So after I read A Court of Thorns and Roses, I read this book called Shady Hollow, and this is another book that I read in my reading vlog, so again, I'm just going to give a very brief description. But this is a murder mystery book, except all of the characters are woodland creatures, and it's basically just the coziest, most adorable book you're ever going to read. So I would highly recommend it. It's really not that long. It's only 200 something pages, so you can definitely read this over a weekend or something, and you will not regret it. Also, the cover is just really, really pretty. So there's that. So yeah, 4 stars, would highly recommend. So then the next book I read was The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and I actually took a trip to Scotland at the end of September, so this was my travel book, so I read this on the plane and while I was there. And this was actually the perfect travel book to bring along with me because Taylor Jenkins Reid's writing is so easy to read, and the story was so interesting that I didn't get bored even for a 7-hour plane ride. So this story goes over the life of an actress named Evelyn Hugo, and it goes over how she met and married 7 different men over the course of her life. So we get to see a lot of old Hollywood with the glitz and glam and drama and all of that kind of stuff, which is super fun to read about. But then there's also a secondary plot that follows a woman named Monique, and she's the writer who Evelyn Hugo has hired to write her biography, and Monique doesn't know how Evelyn knows who she is or why she was chosen to write this book. So that part is also very interesting, and the story kind of switches POVs between Monique's story and Evelyn Hugo's story, so I feel like that's really interesting and it keeps the story fresh and it helps this be a really good page turner. This is my second Taylor Jenkins Reid book that I've ever read. I read Malibu Rising before this in the summertime, and I loved that one as well. So overall, I'm rating this 4 stars. If you're into Taylor Jenkins Reid or you want to read about some old Hollywood drama, then I would definitely give this one a go. So next I read The 7-Year Slip. So this is actually a romance novel, which I don't tend to read a ton of romance, except for in the summertime for some reason, where I just randomly get into romance for like a month and then I kind of phase out of it. But since romance books tend to be a lot quicker to read and shorter than a lot of like fantasy books, then I feel like this is a really great palate cleanser between larger books. So I actually started The 7-Year Slip at the same time that I started reading Golden Sun, which I have not normally started 2 books at the same time because frankly that's just chaotic behavior. So after getting a few chapters into Golden Sun, I decided to download The 7-Year Slip on my Kobo so that if I was having dedicated sit-down reading time, I would read Golden Sun, And if I was just kind of trying to read while I was eating or reading just before bed when I was a little bit too sleepy to concentrate on Golden Sun, then I would read this. And I do like the idea of keeping a secondary book going on my Kobo for whenever I'm reading a larger physical copy book, because I feel like if I'm just trying to read while I'm eating, or if I'm kind of tired but I want to read a little bit before bed and I just don't have the capacity to like concentrate on a more complicated book, then I can still get a few pages of reading done. And I really like how on the Kobo I can still access all of my books on my phone, because then if I'm just out and about and I don't have a book with me on my Kobo, then I can just pull out my phone and just read a few pages if I'm waiting for an appointment or something like that. So I do actually feel like reading these both at the same time was not that difficult. I thought I was going to start getting confused, but since the 7-Year Slip was such an easy book to get through, I didn't have a problem with that. So this book is a romance rom-com type of book, and it follows a girl named Clementine who is a book publicist, and she works in New York City, and she is a bit of a workaholic. And she ends up staying at her aunt's apartment, which is a little bit magical, and one day when she comes home, she finds that there is a man in her apartment, and he may or may not be from a different time. So I'll let you read this and figure out what that means. Overall, I rate this book about a 3 stars. I really enjoyed it and I don't really have any issues with it, but I just don't tend to rate romance books that high because they're not my preferred genre. But like I said, I really like having this alongside a heavier book or as a palate cleanser between other books, because I just really appreciate having something that's just easy and mindless to read through. So the next book I have to talk about, I actually didn't read, but I listened to the audiobook of, and it is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. So if you haven't read this book yet, but you've been interested in it, I definitely would recommend trying out the audiobook, because Jeanette is such a good storyteller, and having her telling the stories to me kind of just felt like having a friend talking to me, and I really appreciated that. So if you don't know, Jeanette McCurdy was a child actress, and she was really well known on the series iCarly, where she played the character Sam, but she also worked on a lot of other projects and also had a singing career. So this book is a series of stories from Jeanette's childhood to the present, and she talks about what it's like growing up in Hollywood as a child star, and she also talks a lot about her relationship between herself and her mother, who was quite abusive. Overall, this is an extremely sad story with a lot of really heavy topics, including eating disorders, so if that's a trigger for you, maybe consider staying away from this book. But I just think this is such an important story to be out there in the world, especially since I know for myself, when I was a kid, I was so jealous of all of the child stars on these TV shows. So to hear them now coming out with stories about how it was not all fun and games and they actually went through a lot to be there, I just think that's a really important message to send out into the world. And I don't feel totally comfortable giving a rating to a story that's an autobiography, so I'm not really going to comment on the story itself, even though I thought it was good, but like, it's weird to say if it's good when it's someone's life, right? But if I'm rating the storytelling and the writing itself, that's definitely a 5 out of 5. I also recently have been listening to Alison Stoner's podcast called Dear Hollywood, where she talks about her experience as being a Disney star growing up. So if you read I'm Glad My Mom Died and you wanted some more stories about child actors and their experiences, I would definitely recommend the podcast Dear Hollywood. So that is all of the books that I read in September and October. I've had a really lucky couple of months reading. I think it's mostly because I've just been reading popular books that were likely to be really good, but I've only had a couple of books that were iffy, but no bad books at all. So that is very lucky, and I hope to stay on that streak. But I will try my best to keep reading as much as possible throughout November and December so I can finish this year off strong. But please let me know if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts were, or if you have any book recommendations, please comment those down below. And I hope to see you next time. Bye!